Hello, this is Dr. Morris. I'm doing a review for the Exam 4 material for Anatomy and Physiology 2. That's course number BSc 2086.050. This will be a review of both the lecture material and the lab material. I'll go ahead and get started with the lecture portion of the exam first, and then I'm going to put up two PowerPoint presentations. One will be on the lymphatic system, and the other PowerPoint presentation will be on the circulatory system. Both of these PowerPoint presentations are under course documents, under the lab portion of the course. So it's the same PowerPoint presentation that you see there under course documents. I will share the desktop or my desktop with you while I'm doing the review when I put those PowerPoint presentations up. Let me go ahead and start with the lecture portion of the exam. Again, you realize we'll be covering the circulatory system and the lymphatic system. Some key points you should recognize. You should know what the definition of an aneurysm is. An aneurysm can occur in several vessels, several different locations in vessels throughout the body. An aneurysm in the brain or in the cerebral circulation can cause significant problems. You should be familiar with an aneurysm in the brain. You should be familiar with the particular types of illnesses that are associated with aneurysms in the brain. You should be familiar with the various layers of the blood vessels. When I say layers, I mean the tunica externa, the tunica interna, the tunica intima, the tunica adventitia. All of these areas can be described clearly on blood vessels, so you should be able to identify these not only anatomically by illustration or by gross dissection, but you should also be able to tell me what is the importance of each of those layers. For example, the muscular layer of blood vessels is contained within those areas. And you should be able to tell me what layer the muscular layer is in. Which layer is the most external, which layer is the most medial portion of the blood vessel. So you should be able to describe each of those areas of blood vessels, each of those layers. There are various blood vessels that I would expect you to be able to clearly recognize simply by a description. You should be able to identify the common iliac artery. You should be able to identify the common carotid artery. You should be able to identify the femoral artery, the popliteal artery, and the tibial artery. You should be able to tell me what are the branches of the common iliac artery. And when I say the branches, I mean a major branch that would come off the common iliac, a major branch that would come off the carotid artery, femoral artery, and the popliteal artery. There are particular blood vessels that will receive blood from the head, neck, chest, and shoulders and arms of the body, and then bring that blood back to the heart. So, again, we need the vessel, or I need you to be able to identify the vessel that receives blood from the upper portion of the body, the head, the neck, the shoulders, and the arms, then brings that blood back to the heart. Similarly, there is a vessel that's located that's located in the heart that brings blood from the lower extremities, the lower abdomen, the abdomen, and the thoracic cavity, and brings blood back into the heart. You should be able to identify that vessel as well. Now remember, vessels that bring blood back to the heart are veins. Vessels that take blood away from the heart are arteries. You should be able to identify the baroreceptors. And baroreceptors are located at in different vessels in the body. You should be able to know those locations. There is an aortic baroreceptor. Once this baroreceptor is stimulated, it causes specific activity to occur. Remember, the baroreceptors are a portion of the nervous system, and so you get specific nervous system stimulation or innervation, and it causes specific activity. So again, stimulation of the aortic baroreceptors will cause a specific reflex, and you should be able to identify what that is. You should be able to tell me the importance of the hepatic portal vein. The hepatic portal vein. Where is it located, and what is its primary role? You should be able to tell me the different portions of the aorta. the different portions of the aorta. Remember, the aorta is the major vessel that comes out of the left ventricle of the heart. It curves or it arches as it leaves the heart, which is referred to as the aortic arch. There is the thoracic aorta and the abdominal aorta, and then it will bifurcate in the lower abdomen. You should be able to identify each of those divisions. There are key landmarks that identify where the aortic arch starts and where the thoracic aorta begins, where the thoracic aorta ends, and where the abdominal aorta begins. There are specific anatomical markers that divide the aorta into those different portions, and you should be able to identify that. There are two common iliac veins. These veins form or join to form another vessel. You should be able to identify those vessels, or that vessel. You should be able to identify and describe the greater saphenous vein. There are smaller veins that join together to form the greater saphenous vein, and you should be familiar with those. There is also a femoral vein, and similarly, there are smaller veins that make the femoral vein, and you should be able to tell me what those vessels are as well. I'll ask you a question about one of those, maybe two of those, through the exam. Now, there is a concept referred to as peripheral resistance, peripheral resistance. In fact, the term total peripheral resistance is a term that I would expect you to be able to identify. There are certain factors that are related to total peripheral resistance. You should be able to tell me the factors that are involved in total peripheral resistance. And again, I think I've already asked you, and I know I did starting off, the different layers of the blood vessels and what are located within those layers. Again, the tunica intima, the tunica media, tunica externa, or so on. I've already gone over that. There are two hormones that are secreted in the body that affect volume status in the body. And particularly, these hormones are involved if the body suffers from hemorrhage or significant hemorrhage or serious hemorrhage. These hormones are antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. You would need to be able to explain to me why these hormones are important and why would you see these hormones being secreted in the event of the loss of a significant amount of blood or fluid. Now, there are also structures within the venous system referred to as venous valves. Now, valves, these are typically one-way valves, and they have specific functions. You should be able to tell me the specific function of the venous valve. The subclavian artery. You should be able to identify the subclavian artery. Subclavian artery, as it passes under the clavicle, changes, and it's called a different vessel once it passes under the clavicle. You should be able to identify that vessel. The subclavian also has some branches. You should be able to identify the major branches of the subclavian artery. You should be able to compare and contrast an artery with a vein. Compare and contrast an artery with a vein. There are some similarities, but there are some differences as well. Again, the hormone aldosterone. You should be able to tell me what will occur with high levels of aldosterone being secreted. You should also be able to tell me what would occur in the body if there were low levels of aldosterone. You should be able to tell me the risk factors that are associated with causing atherosclerosis. You should be able to classify the various veins. Remember, there are large veins, and then there are smaller veins, and these are each classified based upon their sizes. You should be able to classify the veins. Now, there is a term referred to as blood pressure. Blood pressure is generated by the heart, but it's also generated by aspects of peripheral resistance. Clinically, when I use the term typically when I use the term blood pressure, it refers to pressure in the arterial system. And you should be able to describe what is meant by blood pressure and describe the components that make up blood pressure. What factors are involved in creating blood pressure? Now, there are cells that are important in the immune system. These are referred to as lymphocytes. Now, lymphocytes are found in some specific organs. You should be able to identify the organs where we would see lymphocytes. There are also aspects of the systems of our body's non-specific defenses, now, the body's non-specific defenses, you should be able to identify those, and then you should also be able to identify the body's specific defenses. So differentiate between specific defenses and non-specific defenses. There are some physical barriers that help protect the body against infection or against infectious organisms or pathogens. You should be able to give me some examples of those physical barriers. There is a class of antibody. Now remember, antibodies are those proteins that are produced inside the body that help to fight off infection, not to be confused with antibiotics, which are synthetically produced medications that help fight infection. Antibodies are produced in the body, and you should be able to class the antibodies. There are several different types: IgA, IgG, IgM, IgD, IgE. Each of them have specific roles. You should be able to tell me what those roles are. One of those particular classes of antibodies are the first to be secreted in response to a bacterial infection. We refer to bacteria in the body as an antigen. So to say it more scientifically, give me the class of antibody that's secreted in response to the introduction of a new antigen into the body. There is a specific organ that's responsible for the production of plasma protein. You should be able to tell me the organ that's responsible for the production of plasma protein. Lymphoid tissue is found in significant quantity in several of the organs in the body. One organ has the most or has the greatest quantity of lymphoid tissue. Should be able to identify that organ in the adult body. You should also be able to describe to me the various types of immunity. There are naturally acquired active immunities. There are innate immunities. There are artificially acquired active immunities and artificially acquired passive immunities. Should be able to tell me the different types of immunities that you can see and be able to give me an example of them. You should be able to tell me the relationship between B cells and helper T cells. B cells and helper T cells. Should be able to tell me in T cells and B cells how they're activated. T cells and B cells can be activated, but they can only be activated by a specific process that must take place. Should be able to tell me what that process is. You should be able to identify the term humoral immunity. Humoral immunity. What cells are particularly responsible for humoral immunity? Lymphatic vessels occur in all portions of the body. There are some exceptions. You should be able to identify the exceptions to where we would not see lymphatic vessels. There's a term referred to as lymphadenopathy. Lymphadenopathy. Should be able to give me a clear definition of that term, lymphadenopathy. Again, as you classify the various types of antibodies in the body, the immunoglobulins, the antibodies, IgE, IgA, IgG, IgD, each have a specific role, and you should be able to identify those roles. I know that's being redundant, but there's another question about that, so make sure you're familiar with that. Now, lymphatic capillaries. Lymphatic capillaries. Should be able to give me a good description of lymphatic capillaries. And you should be able to give me not only a good description of it, but you should also be able to tell me the function of these lymphatic capillaries. There's a phenomenon that will occur when a person gets an infection. The lymph glands around the area of the infection will become swollen. Describe to me that process. What actually is occurring when those lymph glands swell? There's also a process or phenomenon referred to as inflammation. Inflammation typically is produced in a localized area. should be able to give me the characteristics of inflammation. Let's see, jumping back to the circulatory system again. I asked you to differentiate between arteries and veins. You should be able to identify the major types of veins and the major types of arteries that we see in the body. Major type of vein would be like the superior inferior vena cava, saphenous vein, jugular vein, femoral vein. These are major veins in the body that you should be able to clearly identify. And I may ask you some questions about location. And particularly what I'm looking for is that you understand the major veins, for example, that are located in the lower extremities versus the upper extremities. You should be able to identify some of the following arteries. Should be able to identify the radial and ulnar artery. Should be able to identify the subclavian artery, the axillary artery. You should be able to identify the portions of the aorta, the branches of the abdominal aorta. You should be able to identify all the branches of the abdominal aorta. At the point of bifurcation, the aorta divides into two major vessels that enters into the lower extremities. You should be able to identify the vessels that actually branch, or the bifurcation of the aorta. You should be able to identify the brachiocephalic trunk, where that's located at, the common carotid arteries, both the left and the right common carotid arteries. You should identify the major branches from the aortic arch. Let's see, I asked you that already. Let's see. You should be able to identify the vessels that are primarily in control of controlling the peripheral resistance in the body. There's a particular class of blood vessel that's responsible for that. You should be able to identify the differences in pressure between the arterial system and the venous system. And I mean that generally. I mean, you don't have to give me specific numbers, but you should just be able to tell me the differences between pressures that we see in the arterial system versus the venous system. There's a term referred to as edema. You should be able to identify that definition. You should be able to describe to me the popliteal vein, where it's located at, what vessels join to make the popliteal vein. Popliteal vein on the right and left will join to form another vessel. Should be able to identify that. There is a vessel referred to as the internal iliac and the external iliac. And then there's the common iliac. There are vessels that join together to form those vessels, and you should be familiar with those structures. There is a duct related to the lymphatic system referred to as the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct drains lymphatics from a particular area of the body. You should be able to identify the particular area that is drained by the thoracic duct. In elderly individuals, as they get older, they have changes in the circulatory system. You should be familiar with the changes that you typically see in an elderly person related to the circulatory system. Inside the brain, remember the brain receives arterial circulation. You should be familiar with the anatomy of the circle of Willis and the branches from the circle of Willis. Should be familiar with the term middle cerebral artery. What's the significance of the middle cerebral artery? You should be familiar with the venous system of the brain, the dural sinuses that are a part of the venous drainage of the vessels, of the venous drainage of the blood in the brain. Now, that covers the material that will be on the lecture portion of the exam. I'm going to share my desktop now and bring up a couple of PowerPoints. These PowerPoints, again, are located on the course documents on Blackboard. And I'll give you the presentation, show you the presentation on the lymphatic system and the presentation on the circulatory system. Give me just a moment. Okay, I'll do the lymphatic system first. It's very brief. Some structures I would expect you to be able to identify for the portion of the exam. The green vessels are the lymphatic vessels. Probably already familiar with that. I certainly would expect you to be able to recognize the thoracic duct. Should be able to identify that structure. I would also expect you to be able to recognize the structure, the cisternaculae. See located here. The rest of the thoracic vessel is the thoracic duct. The structure located here. Expect you to be able to identify that. Some vessels that are located here that also I will expect you to be able to identify on the vascular portion. Obviously, the superior vena cava, which typically will connect to the heart, and I'll show you that in just a little bit. The brachiocephalic veins, big vessels that I would expect you to be able to identify here. You can also see the right lymphatic duct, And the next picture will show you the structure, the portions of the body that are drained by each of the lymphatics. The thoracic duct is responsible for drainage of the all of the left half of the body and a portion of the right half of the body. Whereas the right thoracic duct is responsible for the right chest wall, the right breast, and the right arm, in portions of, in half the portion of the head. You do need to know the distribution of the drainage of both thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. That will be a test question, and I also will ask you that as a portion of the lab. Now, for the circulatory system, I do expect you to be able to identify the major coronary arteries, the left main artery, the left circumflex artery, the left anterior descending artery, and the right coronary artery. Notice that they both come off of the base. Both the left main artery and the right coronary artery come off of the base of the aorta. So as blood is pushed out of the heart, when the heart goes into diastole, there's actually a bit of regurgitation that will occur in the blood. As the aortic valve closes off, the regurgitated blood then goes into the right and the left coronary arteries, and that's how the blood is pushed or pumped into the coronary arteries. So the filling of the heart muscle itself actually occurs during diastole when the heart is at rest. We should know the location of those vessels. This is a comparing and contrasting of the lumen of a vein and an artery. Again, you should be familiar with the various layers of the vessels, the differences between the artery and the vein. Again, this is a vein. You can see it's much more thin wall versus an artery, which is much more thick wall. This is just an illustration of plaque. I don't think I asked you a question about that. Just an overview of the major vessels of the body. Again, I would expect you to identify or be able to identify the aorta. Remember, I told you before, the aorta arches, and as it moves, as it takes that curve and heads downward, there's the thoracic aorta, the abdominal aorta. There are some specific landmarks here. The abdominal aorta is actually created by the diaphragm. Landmark the thoracic aorta while it is located in the thoracic chest wall. You should be able to identify the subclavian artery. As you can see, one of the first branches of the subclavian artery is the internal thoracic artery. And off of the internal thoracic artery are arteries that actually go to the ribs. These are the intercostal arteries, as you can see, located under the ribs. As the subclavian artery passes under the clavicle, it turns into the axillary artery. From the axillary artery, then you'll see it branches. It turns into the brachiocephalic. From there, you'll see that the artery branches into two portions. This is the two portions are the radial artery, which is on the thumb side, and the ulnar artery, which is on the small finger or the fifth digit side. Okay. So again, you need to be able to follow the course of that artery. Again, the subclavian artery turning into the axillary artery, axillary turning into the brachial then dividing further into the radial and the ulna. Now, if you notice on the left side, the structure is just a little bit different, not dramatically, but a little bit different. The branches come off. There is if you come off the aorta, remember you had a brachiocephalic trunk here as it came off the aorta, then went into its other divisions. On the right side, there is the aortic arch, and then off the arch, at the superior aspect of the arch, the left common carotid artery comes directly off of the aortic arch, whereas on the right side, you see that the right common carotid artery actually comes off that brachiocephalic trunk. These are the vessels of the brain. And this is a good illustration of what we refer to as the circle of Willis, or the cerebral arterial circle, anterior communicating artery, anterior cerebral artery, posterior communicating, and the posterior cerebral artery. I would expect you to be able to identify those vessels. I would also expect you to be able to identify the middle cerebral artery. And there are some important factors about the middle cerebral artery that I would expect you to know. You should also be familiar with the basilar artery. The basilar artery actually feeds the circle of Willis, or the cerebral arterial circle. There's also the two vessels, vertebral vessels, that actually join together to form the basilar artery. Another view, I would expect you to identify the brachiocephalic trunk. First branch is common carotid. As you can also see, off this brachiocephalic trunk is going to be the subclavian. When the subclavian crosses under the clavicle, it turns into the axillary artery. Also, you can follow the course of the vertebral artery. Remember, the two vertebral arteries go and join together to form the basilar artery. The common carotid artery, as it ascends up, branches into the internal carotid, the external carotid artery. The venous system runs a similar course, and actually the name of many of the vessels are the same as what we see in the arterial circulation. I would expect you to identify the right brachiocephalic. Off that brachiocephalic are some other vessels, the vertebral vein, the external jugular vein, the internal jugular vein. Similarly, you also see off of the major trunk the right subclavian vein. As the right subclavian vein crosses under the clavicle, it turns into the axillary vein. The aorta, I've already kind of gone over for you. Again, the aortic arch, thoracic aorta, diaphragm, abdominal aorta. There are branches off the abdominal aorta that I'll go over in just a second. Superiorly, remember, off the aortic arch, you're going to see the carotid artery, common carotid, actually coming off the aortic arch. On the left side, the right side, there is the brachiocephalic trunk, and then the common carotid comes off that brachiocephalic trunk. The thoracic artery, internal thoracic arteries, as you can see. The common carotid arteries go up and they branch off to the internal, external carotid arteries. As we go down the abdominal wall, there are not any branches as it comes off the thoracic aorta, but as we get into the abdominal aorta, you can see one of the major trunks is the celiac trunk that comes off the abdominal aorta. Oops, sorry, went up, scooted one. You also see the renal arteries, right and left renal arteries. You also will see the inferior mesenteric artery, superior mesenteric artery. These feed the gastrointestinal tract. The branches, as the aorta goes into the abdominal aorta, you'll see a major bifurcation here. This major bifurcation is the right and left iliac arteries. Inside the abdomen, you should be somewhat familiar with the celiac trunk. It has vessels that feed several organs. There's a hepatic artery, gastric artery that's fed off the celiac trunk, so be familiar with that. Splenic artery, the superior mesenteric artery and its branches, the inferior mesenteric artery and its branches, and what it feeds. Now, you don't have to know each of these individual branches. I just primarily, you should just have a good general knowledge of, like, the inferior mesenteric artery is going to feed the lower colon, whereas the superior mesenteric artery is going to feed the upper colon, the celiac, which is going to feed the gastric, spleen, and liver. And again, you see in the venous system, where you saw the arteries, you typically don't see the vein. The vessels are very much similar. The only difference is these will be the vessels that will bring blood back to the heart. So as you notice in some of the descriptions with the veins, it's 2 vessels will join together, 3 vessels will join together to form another vessel, whereas when we talked about the arterial circulation, the vessel is actually coursing out, and so it will divide to feed blood to areas. So here in the venous system, vessels are joining to bring blood back to the heart. In the arterial system, vessels are dividing to take blood to extremities. Here are some of the major arteries in the lower extremity. I've already alluded to those previously. External and internal iliac arteries. As you can see, this vessel, as it passes lower into the extremity, will divide into the femoral arteries. Femoral arteries will further bifurcate. You'll see the popliteal artery. Popliteal artery is a major landmark, usually found right behind the knee. You can feel the pulsation, actually, posterior knee. That vessel is further divided into anterior and posterior tibial arteries. And then 2 landmarks that are important, and I would expect you to know: the dorsalis pedis vessel. This is important because this is where we palpate for a pulse in the foot. Then there is also the posterior tibialis artery, posterior tibial artery. And again, that's another landmark where you actually can palpate, feel for a pulse. So 2 landmarks that are important to know that you'll be asked about: dorsalis pedis and posterior tibial vessel. Popliteal vessel is another area where you can feel for a pulse. And then the femoral artery as well. It's another area where you can feel for a pulse. And that's why those vessels are, that's why they're important, because they're landmarks that you'll need to know clinically. They're important for other reasons as well, but I do want you to know those specific landmarks. And again, on the venous system, again, as we saw the arteries, you see complementary veins as well. Typically where there's an artery, there will be a vein. Should be somewhat familiar with the drainage of these vessels. Take blood back to the heart system. As you can see, the greater saphenous in the femoral vein will go on to join to form the external iliac vessel. The common iliac will go on to form the inferior vena cava and move up. And that basically covers the circulatory system. Those are the items I'll ask you to be able to identify for the purposes of the exam. And that covers the material that will be on the exam too. Good luck with studying for the exam.